All those who were after that, they had to join either on Facebook or.
Okay, I've got on my computer now. Well,
Yeah,
switch.
okay.
Okay. Varushka, you can go ahead.
Okay. Welcome to day 2. Namaste and greetings. I, Varushka Bhushan, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI Web Policy Learning. The International Day of Women in Diplomacy, observed annually on June 24th and declared by the UNGA's 76th session, celebrates women's contributions to diplomacy, honoring their achievements and advocating for gender equality. Despite 16 countries adopting feminist foreign policy since 2014, true feminist principles are often diluted in practice. To mark this day, IMPRI and the Asia Foundation announced the launch of Feminist Foreign Policy, Past, Present, and Future, reflecting their commitment to advocacy, education, and youth empowerment. This is a 3-day immersive online certificate training symposium to be held between June 24th and June 26th. This pioneering 3-day immersive online certificate training symposium is designed to immerse the next generation of leaders into the intricate world of diplomacy and gender equality. We welcome you and thank you for joining us in this journey of mutual learning. The chair for this program is Professor Vibhuti Patel, a visiting distinguished professor at IMPRI, and our expert panel for this program includes Ms. Stephanie Foster, Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharya, Ambassador Lata Reddy, Ms. Nandita Barua, Dr. Shweta Singh, Professor Anuradha M. Chinoy, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, and Ambassador Riva Ganguly Das, with our governors being Ms. Nandita Barua, Ms. Apurva Singh, Dr. Arjun Kumar, Dr. Simi Mehta, and our coordinators being Mr. Satyam Tripathi, Ms. Vidita Jha, and Ms. Shweta Shankar Pidimari. Proceeding further, we welcome everyone to this transformative journey and appreciate your dedication in investing your time, energy, and commitment to gaining a profound understanding of the crucial role and intricate details of policy and feminism. We will also share outlines and reading resources in your emails at the end of every session. And before we start today, I would like to make some housekeeping announcements. The first being, please join the meeting on time. There will be a question and answer session after each presentation. We request you to put all the questions into the Q&A box, and please do not post your questions as an anonymous attendee. We would appreciate if your questions are precise, and please refrain from making general comments to save time. I would now like to invite our chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Varushka, for introducing the program, and welcome today's esteemed guest, Ms. Nandita Barua. She's also the co-organizer, Dr. Shweta Singh, Dr. Professor Anuradha Shinoy. And also, first of all, I would like to congratulate and thank both IMPRI team and the Asia Foundation for organizing this very important program, about which a lot of healthy curiosity is there among the citizens, researchers, scholars, think tanks, politicians, and practitioners in social movements. Now, first, let us have a recap of what transpired yesterday, where Dr. Simi Mehta shared vision, mission, goals, objectives of online symposium on the occasion of International Day of Women in Diplomacy, which is observed annually on 24th June. She also gave brief highlights of earlier efforts of IMPRI on this subject in the year 2022 and 23. Ms. Nandita Barua introduced Asia Foundation and its contribution in promoting dialogues on feminist foreign policy as a current development in geopolitics demands gender lens to the traditional areas of foreign policy. She also stated, and I quote, that feminist foreign policy takes a bottom-up approach, and she also talked about the hard topic and the soft topic. Women are generally assigned the soft areas in feminist policy, and the hard talks remains a male prerogative, and we need to even break this kind of a gender binary. In my introduction, I highlighted the symbiotic relationship between the global feminist movement, transnational solidarity, and the thinking about the feminist foreign policy. Ms. Stephanie Foster, in her inaugural presentation, eloquently highlighted foundations of feminist foreign policy and the fundamental concepts of gender equality, women's leadership in security sector, representation and inclusion of diverse voices that are discussed and utilized by governments, women's rights groups, civil society organizations, and researchers in think tanks and academia as they conceptualize, institutionalize, and implement feminist foreign policy in their respective contexts. She also averred that if you can't see it, you can't be it. That means hence representation and voice of women in diplomatic discourses and missions are of utmost importance. She described trajectories of countries who either adopted feminist foreign policy or feminist trade policy or feminist development policy. The 16 countries which from the time of 2014 till now, various ups and downs that have taken place regarding this discourse on feminist policy, and also whether you call it gender equality policy or feminist policy, that was also debated. Professor Sanjukta Bhattacharjee, she talked about the origin and trajectory of feminist foreign policy after providing historical unfolding of global feminist movement in a chronological order from 1975 till 2023. And its interface with the UN system. She stated that introduction of feminism as an ideology in the study of international relations and foreign policy has challenged the notions of power, conflict, security, sovereignty, which are traditionally seen as a masculine domain, and theorizing the importance of peace, security, gender justice for execution of feminist foreign policy requires questioning stereotypical construction of masculinity and femininity in relation to significant sites of power and leadership, and dismantling of gender binaries and also unequal power relations between North and South that up. And she gave ample examples and also talked about what is currently happening in Gaza and in the previous such conflicts, territorial conflicts. She said that we need to change the international behavior. We should focus on women as a universal category, not as a ghetto. And also reproduction of intersectional relations in the foreign policy is extremely important. The last speaker of the day was Ambassador Latha Reddy, who spoke on WPS, Women, Peace and Security. She, as a former Indian foreign officer, she drew her experiences of 36 years in diplomacy and shared her first-hand experiences of meeting complex challenges of global diplomacy. She illustrated the nuances of women's rights within the diplomatic domain and the need to critically reflect on international power structures, address the needs of all groups, and place human security and human rights at the center of international discussion. And she exemplified it by enthusiastically narrating two heart-touching incidents with human face, like at the time in the midst of humanitarian crisis. The first one was extradition of 15,000 Indian citizens in distress in Thailand in the year 2013. And second one was evacuation of 16,000 Indians in inaccessible locations from Libya, where the workers were left in lurch due to shameful role played by companies who abandoned them. And it was an uphill task to transport Indian citizens from Tripoli and Benghazi to the safer place. And she praised Ambassador of Tunisia, Mani Meklaiji, who housed the Indian refugees in the embassy building, as well as in the lawns of embassy in Tunisia and Egypt. She also provided insights into her lasting contribution on various cyber issues. And I think it was a very, very rewarding and enlightening day one that we had. And today we are going to have the similarly extremely interesting sessions by our three well-known erudite speakers and also practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for starting us off today and recapping yesterday. And with that, I would like to move on to our first speaker for the day. And I'm delighted to invite Ms. Nandita Baruaji, India's country representative for the Asia Foundation, for her session on feminist foreign policy, evolving issues. The floor is all yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Varushka. I want to bring in my warm welcome to all the participants from, I think, across different parts of India, but also outside of India, who probably joined us today. for this conversation. Also want to thank Professor Patel and IMPRI, Dr. Arjun and Simi, for really taking the lead to expand this conversation on feminist foreign policy, beyond which is so far being a much smaller group that has been talking about it both within India and in some of our neighboring countries. But I think the time for Asia, and more particularly, let me just focus on South Asia, is now to really start having a much more robust discourse, a discussion and understanding of what would it mean for our part of the world to adopt a much more forward-looking feminist lens and inclusive lens in all our foreign policy engagement. So with that, I think I want to say that yesterday's sessions covered a lot of ground on the issue, and those of the participants who were present yesterday actually heard a very, very, I think, enriching conversation that happened. Not to mention, of course, Professor Foster's laying down the entire framing of the issue from where it began, followed by the other speakers, which Professor Patel has just explained how each of the speaker contributed to really expanding this very conversation and creating a new lens of looking at foreign policy from various sectoral perspectives, whether you're doing health or international relations or just evacuation, emergencies, you name it. So with that, I think I'm going to delve a little bit deeper, and I think some of it might be things that you've already heard, but we could probably have a more deeper conversation as we go ahead on this construct of what is feminist foreign policy. How does it apply to the countries of the global south? What role can countries like India play in owning it, defining it, and leading it? And more importantly, what are the challenges as well in our parts of the world? For the Asia Foundation, I think our journey in looking at this issue began sometime in 1921, I think, so 2021. When we had a couple of young scholars come up to us, Kubana and CSR, talk about, taking this agenda up and saying, well, many countries are actually talking about a much more gendered lens, inclusive lens in the area of foreign policy, which has not so far been a case in the global south that largely, of course, with the exception of countries like Brazil and Mexico, having had a head start. So with that initiation, I think the conversation has grown. And I want to share that when we first started talking about this issue within the groups in Delhi, think tanks, diplomats, bureaucrats, academics, there was still a lot of hesitation to actually even embracing the word feminist in foreign policy. And so there was a lot of debate on whether you should, is feminist the right word? Should we call it gendered foreign policy? Are we prepared really as countries and nations to really talk about foreign policy, which is seen as this thing which remains outside the realm and engagement of non-state players, and bring in the framing feminist into it. And it was a very interesting initial 6 months to a year of discussion on just the terminology. But after a period of intensive discussions, and some of the speakers who have already spoken yesterday and will continue to speak in the coming days, today and tomorrow, were a part of this conversation, I think it was agreed that when we use the word feminist, I think one thing is we need to take away the mindset around that word, the pushback to the word, and really clearly state that when we say feminist foreign policy, we are actually talking about a much more inclusive lens in an area of engagement which is global, in an interconnected world where disproportionate inequalities exist, where marginalization exists. And bringing in the word feminist in foreign policy engagement means you're actually encouraging countries and nations to really look deeply into the ways the inequities, inclusions, exclusions, and diversities play out in country, and how those can be addressed in a more equitable way. And so I think when we talk about the feminist foreign policy, it's not just about having a women's agenda or putting women at the center. When you use the term feminist foreign policy, or feminist for that matter, you're talking about a much larger inclusive word, which is actually looking at marginalized and vulnerable sections of population. And yes, women form a large majority, because by very virtue of being in a patriarchal system globally, women are at the end in that box of larger set of inequalities that globally we face. That doesn't mean that the feminist foreign policy is tailored to just women. It is tailored to addressing all the inequalities and marginalizations that may exist in any given context and in any given sector. And then it talks about how you engage with it. So yes, as I said, it forces you to rethink traditional power structure. It forces you to have a more bottom-up approach where the solutions that one is prioritizing puts the needs of the marginalized at the center and definitely focuses on human rights as the key principle defining any engagement in foreign policy. Now, the fact that we are saying foreign policy, it means engagement outside of your own nation, which is why it's foreign policy. Policies towards other countries, policies towards other stakeholders in other nations. Having said that, however, I will, expand on this more towards later. I do want to put one thing in front right away. For a feminist foreign policy to be effective, it cannot be devoid of your domestic policies on gender and equity. Any nation which accepts, agrees, and decides to move ahead with a feminist lens in its foreign policy, by very virtue of the definition, will first have to ensure that your domestic policies and your domestic norms on engaging equity and rights are in the right space and in the right parameter. So you need to have domestically proven equitable policies to be able to create a more responsive policy as in player beyond your own borders. So that's the first point. Secondly, I think it's also important that, when we think with a feminist foreign policy lens, we have to understand that as a country engaging with multiple countries, whether it's India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, we engage or the global north, the US, Japan, or the Pacific. We have to recognize that we engage with countries just like as you have disproportionate development and growth within your own nation state, you have disproportionate or inequitable growth globally. Some countries are more developed, some countries are less developed. Some countries have better legal systems, some countries have slightly weaker legal systems. Some countries have more defined democracies, some countries are fledgling democracies and are still emerging to be democratic. So when we say we are going to engage from a foreign policy, feminist foreign policy lens, for every country, it's important to first define the level at which the country is with whom you are engaging, and therefore be cognizant of their needs, in two ways. Let's just put this in perspective. If we are engaging with a country, say, in a disaster situation, and as a foreign policy engagement, most countries rush in to help any country which has faced any disaster. Whether it's India, whether it's Philippines, Japan, US, I think anytime there's a global disaster, the global world unites to support the country which is facing the disaster in trying to ameliorate its challenges. However, when you say that, well, you need to have a foreign policy lens in how you deal with disaster, what that would mean is it will force countries to first identify the level of equity or inequity that is there in the country into which they're entering to support, and make sure that those who are most marginalized are at the forefront of assistance and aid that you're providing. That it becomes mandatory for those countries to make sure that they are most marginalized get the support that you are trying to provide them. It's in a very simplistic way to say, just like any of the development assistance programs, say 50% beneficiaries should be women, in a disaster assistance program, a foreign policy engagement or an engagement on disaster should say that this assistance should be directed by the countries, or we will work to facilitate this access to this assistance to the most marginalized first. Because as it would happen in any country, whether it's India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, US, Canada, UK, Sweden, you name it, people with the foremost access will be the first people to be able to access any support. In most countries, it would be men who would have a greater mobility to access any kind of benefits that you're bringing in. Therefore, ensuring that your assistance is equitably distributed and reaches the most marginalized becomes important. So that's just one example of saying, if you're looking at climate, that's how you would engage with when you say you are having a feminist foreign policy lens, because that lens will force you to make sure that you are taking care of those nuances in your engagement. Let's look at another example. We are going through countries who are deeply today, facing all kind of internal conflicts. There are multiple flashpoints of war. There are multiple flashpoints where legitimately elected governments have been overthrown and been taken over by more regressive regime, more, regimes which are not very tolerant of just even basic human rights for women. Now, many of those countries are in the neighborhood of all of us, whether it's the north or the south or the west or the east. You have many such flashpoint countries where you find that the ruling regime is a particular kind of a regime. It could be a very elite regime. It could be a regime which is very driven by certain, systems and cultural norms which are regressive, which are not inclusive, which undermine women. However, what should countries who believe in equity, who don't believe that those kind of inequities and division should exist, do in their global engagement? You obviously don't forsake those countries simply because a certain kind of a ruling group has come in power, or certain kind of a fundamentalist group has come in power, or certain kind of a military coup group has come in power. The objective of countries who are, looking at themselves as better placed, as somewhat more progressive, somewhat more inclusive, with better democratic systems and governance systems, need to do is not completely denounce your engagement, but define your engagement in a way with those regimes that allow you to provide support, or determine your support, having a negotiating space that says X amount of support will be provided as long as it goes to women who are of the reproductive age group, or women who are pregnant, or girls' education, or young boys and girls. So you have to choose and pick where you will engage in that, but without completely renouncing, because then if you forsake it, you are actually forsaking an entire nation and its people for the sake of a particular ruling elite that might be ruling those countries. You actually go down to the bottom, and because or even those countries need your assistance and support. For example, Afghanistan needs assistance and support for all country, but we know that Afghanistan has got a regime that is highly intolerant of any rights for women. Does that mean we forsake Afghanistan? No, I would say that means that in our negotiation with Afghanistan, we continue to push for more rights for women as a return for the assistance that they seek. Similarly, when countries emerge from conflict and other third countries play a role in peace negotiations, and I have seen that happen in the neighborhood, it becomes imperative that you make sure that women and marginalized groups have a voice at that table for peace. Because in the first place, the conflicts occurred because of inequity. If there was equity, equitable development, equitable growth, or everybody's rights protected, everybody being successful in what you did, rarely would conflicts occur. I'm not saying they may not occur, but rarely would conflicts occur. Conflicts have occurred where there has been inequity, real or perceived at times, from one side or the other. And I think then when you finally bring people to a table to negotiate peace, ensuring that as countries and nations and as institutions which will facilitate peace, whether they are UN, multilateral, bilateral, you have to put it in the right up in front that women, marginalized communities, and people who felt discriminated against have a voice at the table in that negotiation going forward, so that future growth and development of the country post a peace negotiation does not reinvent the inequities that existed, but actually work towards addressing those in a more equitable manner. Again, your moral authority, personally, I feel, to do so would rest on whether you have the same principles applied at your home and in the nations that you represent from. So that's the other thing when we talk about foreign policy engagement. Now, I think because FFP actually plays out both policies and our actions that consciously consider the gendered impact across various sectors, which is what I just said, whether it is development assistance, disaster risk reduction, environment, security, you name it. I want to talk a bit more about in this entire defining and action. I think people need to understand that when you say feminist foreign policy, it's not going to be a single shoe that fits all. It's also not going to be same across sector. It is going to be very, very defined and nuanced across sectors and across countries, depending in the trajectory of your own growth versus your own ability to be able to push forward the agenda in the countries that you are negotiating with. So having said that, I think a couple of critical areas where the world today is focusing on. One, of course, as I said, in negotiating peace. I mean, we are all seeing what's happening in the Middle East. We are all seeing what's happening in our neighborhood, in Myanmar, in Afghanistan. And I think in each of these countries, responsible multilateral, bilateral institutions and nation states who are interested in having an equitable growth system should actually seriously adopt a feminist lens and unpack that in their negotiations, in their engagements, in their support and work with these countries. Climate and disaster is a big story. We have just emerged in Delhi out of a massive heat wave. I don't know whether we have emerged or not, but we are hoping that we are going to emerge out of a heat wave. We have had consistent, high temperature and unprecedented heat in Delhi over the last 1 month. Having said that, we are actually facing climate change real time in our own life. I think this is going to be an area where there is, and we all know there's research to prove it, that the impact of climate change is going to be disproportionate. Rich people will be able to survive it because you have the means to have multiple air conditions, any new technology, have better homes, not go out for work, work from home, have a earning, etc., etc. More economically marginalized groups are going to face a more harsher impact of climate change because their ability to access what you would need to survive climate change will be limited. Therefore, I think when we get into climate negotiations, when we talk about what is our demonstrated commitment to addressing climate change and the associated disaster that it would go, we need to be fully cognizant of these disproportionate variances that we will encounter. It needs to recognize, therefore, climate diplomacy needs to recognize that women and marginalized groups being disproportionately affected. There is, climate change. There's a need for greater investment on those groups going forward. Greater investment for preparedness, greater investment to ameliorate the challenges they would face, greater investment to really actually reduce the consumption that the well-off do, either as individuals or nations, so that the less well-off do not face the unequal burden and the brunt of climate because of the actions of those who have the resources. That, I think, becomes important. And that's, I think, as Prime Minister Modi says, your life model is begin at home. It needs to be something. And home doesn't mean just the individual home. Home means the home countries who sit in the forefront of climate negotiation and demand things or put conditions on other countries. I think those homes also need to relook at their own consumption patterns to ensure that disproportionate climate impact doesn't happen. And that's a critical foreign policy need. Introduce greater gender equity in business models, notably. For example, I think in India and in some of the other African countries and others, we have seen there's been the push, okay, if you're going to go solar, you're going to have renewable energy. What role can women play? Not just as users, but also as promoters and supporters of this technology. So whether you call them solar mamas or solar technicians or women in the forefront of the solar business, all of those needs to have more and more people from those who are usually not in the seat in this discussion to start having a seat in the seat, not just as an end user, but as somebody who decides what the next steps in moving this process forward is going to be at home and abroad. Integrating gender-sensitive approaches in disaster risk reduction policies. I think I have to say that I can at least speak for India and some of the other countries where we have actually had a much deeper look at disaster risk reduction, including Philippines as well, where I think identifying who are most at risk during disaster has become a science and a technology-driven process. So you have to have the information beforehand, and you can only have it once you recognize that there is going to be a greater need when a disaster happens for certain people of certain age, old, elderly, people with disability, younger children, pregnant women, single mother. So I think these are emerging trends that we have to keep focusing on as we plan for an approach on feminist foreign policy. I know I don't know how much time I have, Varushka, maybe another 5 to 7 minutes. I'd just like to cover 2 more points. I think the one thing which I talked yesterday was about this soft and hard diplomacy. And I think usually we tend to say, well, feminist foreign policy is good for the softer part of diplomacy. Yeah, disaster mein chalega, we can do it in disaster. But when it comes to peace and security or armed forces or armaments, negotiations, those national security, those I don't think have the space for feminist foreign policy. Well, I think you're very wrong. Those actually need more women to avoid further escalation of conflicts. Hard issues are not just hard issues, and national security issues are not just simply issues that impact men. National security issues impact women and marginalized as much, and not having them in the forefront of both the conversation and the solution is not acceptable. Going forward, I think we need to stop having this division between hard and soft issues in foreign policy and get the understanding and voices of everybody across. I feel that, for example, countries like Bangladesh, countries like India, we have now opened up our armed forces to women across the board. We are allowing. So therefore, when you put women in charge of security, women should be in the discussions and discourses about security as well, not just in charge of security, about what does security mean? How would national security be represented? What does power itself mean? Defining power to say, is aggression a best means of power, or is inclusion a better means of power? And if it has to be inclusion, how does it do? There are no simplistic solution. We are going to have countries which are going to have a lot of challenges doing this. Finally, I think I'd like to also say that going forward, this is the time for Asia really to have a bigger role and Asian leaders to initiate discussions on gendered foreign policy that are unique to Asia, where I think many of the countries of the global south can play a much bigger role. And as development partners, we can export the learnings from our home. We have to admit and accept and acknowledge the huge contribution of the feminist movement in the global south and how gender issues have been put at the forefront of so many of our policies, whether it's gender budgeting, whether it's gender inclusive health policies across countries. These wins at home now need to become a part of our conversation in our international relations and engagement. And it's time that Asia defined what it means when it says foreign policy from its own perspective. Women-led development has been a slogan for India and for many countries, and I think we need to push that beyond just being a slogan, but put it into action across, whether it's on financial institutions, trade, disaster, security, climate, you name it. I think in forging alliances to develop regional policies, the more countries who come together across and agree on this framework, the better we are in being able to really challenge the stereotypical rules of power and patriarchy collectively. And however, I think finally, a lot of this is going to be defined by a lot more research, a lot more challenges put forward, a lot more, in-depth, let's just say, newer ideas and thinking from a group of people beyond just the realm of political leaders or bureaucrats. The group who is, for example, here today, which is a mixed group. And I think it's going to be important for all of us to collectively delve a little deeper into this and start unpacking it a layer at a time. It might cause some tears in some places, like when you unpack an onion, but I think it's going to be worth every bit. And so we have to put our collective support towards making this happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. That was a really comprehensive overview of what equity means, especially in this context. And before we open the floor for question and answers, I would like to invite Professor Vibhuti Patel for her remarks, and I would like to remind participants to put their questions in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Nandita Barua, for giving us a big canvas of the work that in the area of feminist foreign policy, women's movement, and the thinkers and researchers have done. My question is that during the 80s and 90s, so many consultations, regional consultations among South Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asians were taking place, and so many best practices were gathered from each other. We also had at a practice, in terms of praxis, we had a person, Gandhian like Nirmala Deshpande walking from Delhi to Karachi, and Asma Jahangiri from Women Action Forum coming from there, or women living under Islam. They just went into a boat and mainly taking the issues of Mariam May and all. So these are the small stories which also had a great impact. So in the current context of a very strong right-wing wave where the democratic elected regimes have been thrown out and governments have been thrown out, and more oppressive regimes are there, what kind of incremental advances you see in Asia, which can be aimed at a civil society and women's organization to address the root causes of conflict or structural or geopolitical issues that sustain conflicts, or acknowledge conflict-related violence, which is nothing but a continuum of the non-conflict related violence, no? And that has been the concern of women's movement over last 3 decades. So what kind of creative energy that we can create to bring up this issue, not within the domestic arena, and solidarity, transnational solidarity?
I think, Professor Patel, you've been at the forefront of the women's movement for South Asia and also globally. And I think, like you rightly said, there have been many wins that we have had. And it is actually thanks to those wins only, that today we still have so much more advancement in gender. You know, from the times when we began and when you began till today, it's not like we haven't had advancements. We are, there are more girls in schools today, for example. There are more health practices for women today. There is much more investments in women having more access to finance or pushing women into enterprise. These have been gains that I think the global South has universally seen because of the investments that has happened over the years. And I would not at any point, I think we have to accept, acknowledge, and not negate those. Those are critical. The question is, how do we build? There's also a generational shift today. You know, there's a shift. There's a much larger youth population whose investments in what they see as equity probably might vary from where we began, but it is still valid because it's their time, you know. And I think from where I am, I think my perspective in this is that the creative energy today we need to harness is much more of the younger population, which is globally biggest in South Asia right now, whether it's China, whether it's India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and looking at what would be their priorities. Because at one level, what has drastically changed is technology. Access to information itself changes every day. Access to that changes every minute, you know. And acknowledging that those kind of access to information needs us to be a step ahead in saying, wait a minute, what do young men and young girls and people want? Where did we miss out? And if you ask me why we are still struggling with the same power structures that we dealt 20, 30 years ago, is that somewhere down the line, I feel strongly, and this is my personal view, we did leave the men out of our conversations on feminism. You know, I feel it is becoming imperative to not just get men to support women, but bring men into the conversation of feminism and start asking the hard questions on, is the current construct of masculinity and power that is defining people, institutions, and nations right? You know, and if not, what should that be? Just as an example, today I was horrified in the morning to read a news article. I was just flipping through my newspaper with my cup of coffee, and I see this massive article saying, and you know, the media has put it out as an important article, and which is also challenging to me, that couples in Haryana, in the state of India, are demanding two things. They are saying, one, no person should be allowed to be married without the permission of their parents. So the rider is, we are not against love marriage, but approval of the parents should be taken, because a parent brings up a girl till the age of 18. I'm quoting exactly what it said. And then suddenly, when she turns 18, she takes her Aadhaar card and runs away and elopes. So approval of parents is important, because when they don't take approval, then honor killings happen. So the onus of honor killing is on the woman, because usne approval nahi liya, so she didn't take approval, so she's honor killed. So to avoid honor killing, take approval of your parents. Now, if she had the approval of the parents in the first place, she wouldn't have run away. The fact is, you don't encourage such liaisons. That's why she's walking away. Second demand was that make the marriageable age 60, so that she doesn't get a chance to run away at 18. Okay, so 18, yes, she has the Aadhaar card and run away, make her take her parents' permission, and then 16, and they are demanding that their elected representatives pick up this issue at the coming parliament. This is what they're demanding, and they said, we will go on a, strike, and we'll go on a movement. We'll come to the streets on a movement if you don't take this power. Now, this kind of threatening, I don't think in any democracy at the level at which India is today, as a very mature democracy, should be allowed. It should, across party and political lines, is unacceptable at any given stage.
They got boost because of the government of Gujarat. No, they also said that every marriage parents have to be informed. That's what ruling parties say. Then
Well,
there's
the question
difference.
is whether you inform versus whether taking permission versus reducing it to 16 and versus linking it to honor killing. To me, all of this, demanding that your parliament raise this, is unacceptable.
Correct.
And I would be very, I would say I would like to see which party actually raises this at the parliament to say, bring it down to 16 and let girls who are adult, who can vote without their parents' permission, who can vote against who their parents vote for, should not marry the person they want without their parents' permission. Now, what kind of a dichotomy are we talking about? So I feel that when you have these, and this is again, we didn't take the men along. Somewhere I'm not expecting us to be able to change the cub guys. They're probably, from my perspective, possibly not changeable. Maybe some are, I don't know. But the young men, the women are not just marrying apparition, right? They're marrying another young man who is a man who also is a party to this decision. So where is that coming? Where is the onus? Because when it's an honor killing, both the girl and the boy get killed.
No, and the man is going to suffer more because the Juvenile Justice Act sees this, or even all the criminal justice system sees man as a man in conflict with law. While woman,
Yes, if he's also getting killed.
No, but woman is seen as need of protection, in need of protection.
So I think either which ways, it's no win for both, Dr. Patel. To me, it's not a win. It's not a winning situation for the men. Definitely not for the women. So I feel that the conversations, as you're saying creatively, I'm just giving this as an example of what young people are going to have to deal with, right? More and more young people have the right to choose their partners, I'm sure. The right partners. Yes, everybody makes choices. I mean, a lot of times when parents choose their partners, those relationships also don't necessarily go well. So it's not like a panacea for anything. But I'm just saying the agency to choose cannot be taken away from anyone who is adult. You can't selectively give one agency. I mean, I think voting for your country is a much bigger responsibility than choosing who you marry, frankly. I mean, I probably put them at equal, if nothing else. But you can't say that you're allowed to do this, but you're not allowed to do that. And so get her to marry at 16 so that I have a control. So the boy marries at 16, they go to jail, but the parents getting somebody married at 16 is not a problem because you want to reduce that age. So, these to us, even labor laws. So, Professor Patel, I think creative thinking today requires us to collectively stand up for some of these issues which we have actually dealt with, responded to. They don't require a response anymore, and the legal system does not accept them. For a country like India, none of this, what has been said, is in the legal system. So why are we even getting at this? So I think voice raised to be against issues that have been settled conclusively because of the feminist movement's rights and should not be raked up now for the sake of just somebody's limited interest. So I feel there's a lot that can be done in this area.
Yeah, I think constitution can be the touchstone for this new
Absolutely.
discourses with
Absolutely.
boys and girls. Yeah. Thank you. So there are many questions waiting for you.
Yeah, I'm gonna do my best to give you a compiled sense. But one question I've noticed, or a theme that's been mentioned a couple times, is what are the structural changes that need to be made so that foreign policy as a whole can have a more gender sensitive and feminist approach? And in addition to that, what specifically is the role of, like you said, the global south and countries like India and Asia that may not be the most gender equal in supporting that?
I think structural, here's the thing, in our part of the world, in Asia, we actually have a lot of structural things in place. We have legal systems which have fully endorsed women's and equity, marginalized groups. We are changing the law every year to bring in more equity. We are recognizing different genders, identities across Asia. We're getting there point at a point. But while we are doing a lot of that in paper, it's the practice, So the practice is missing, right? We have gender sensitive, we have gender budgets, but we have legal systems which allows inheritance. We have legal policies which make it, which allows women to inherit property, to own property, but when you actually look at what is happening on the ground, I think there is the big gap, right? And the gap is at various levels. The gap's also happening, one, because while we did all these legal system as law, they happened because there was a movement at the less driven from the grassroots. There were groups who were representatives of the grassroots, but who spoke about this, picked it up, brought it up, and the changes were done. Sometimes the changes are done globally, also, I mean, let's just say in Asia and other countries, without putting a down, bottom end structure on how this will happen. Now, you have a legal system which says all women will be allowed inheritance from their parent, equal inheritance law, parental property, right? But at the same time, you also allow for certain two things happen. You allow that to a segment, but then within the same country, there will be one segment because of certain religious identity will not have access to that law. So it doesn't get applied universally. First big problem. So this disparity created between women of two different identities, whether it's a religious identity or a community identity, because that doesn't get addressed. So say sometimes some tribal communities, hill communities will still have the common code, and then they'll go by that. The second disparity challenge that happens in the structure is while you have created the suprastructure, how will you implement it going down? Is there a concerted effort at every level, from the national capital to the state, to the district, to the ward? Do you have a support system that will make it happen? Is there a legal frontline person right down to the ward level, or just block, forget about village, block level, who can work with women's group and women's organization to ensure that women get a right to property, that they don't get exploited in the patedar system of leaseholding in agricultural land, that they get the equal amount of money for the produce that they're producing? So here is the challenge. Investing in creating the policy is the easiest step. Investing in implementing the policy requires a much larger structural investment with money and human resource and trained human resource. That's where our gap is today. That's where Bina gap is. The challenge is the development assistance that came from the global north to facilitate this also did not invest in the downward stream. They were happy to see the upward changes, and that was it. Okay. Not to say that the developed north is developed in many of these things. They have equal amount of discrimination, equal amount of challenges, equal amount of inequity, and more. So I think I'm just going to focus on Asia, because my thing is Asia is the story. And I would like us to, as a part of the Asian South, really start thinking about where we can start investing our own resources today to strengthen the structure needed to implement the legal, the policy, and the other operational norms that we have created, and to systematize it. That's where the structural challenge is. And highest time, I think biggest thing is behavioral, takes time, but behavior will also happen once you create a structure and there's somebody applying the law. Even on dowry, I mean, the application made the change. It's still happening, but at a much less rate than it was happening when Mrs. Chadda and APA filed the case from Shakti Shalini at that time, at a much less level. Because you implemented it, you said mandatorily, yes, not to say it will not get abused, but everything gets abused. Just because women-centric laws get abused by a certain percentage, you tend to say, oh, these laws are not right. Laws which apply to men largely keep getting abused all the time. That doesn't mean you don't make it accessible to those who need it the most. You just stop the abuse. There's a way to stop the abuse. You can't tell me that states can't do that. States can do much more than that.
Thank you so much. One more question. Because we're sort of talking about equity and we're taking a more global perspective to that, a really interesting question I thought was, to what extent is feminist foreign policy promoting almost Western feminist ideals? And is that in conflict with more local feminist movements? Do they have different priorities, different strategies? And does that raise questions about the legitimacy of foreign actors, or how foreign policy is sort of the West's game? Are those real questions, or are countries able to adopt something that works for them?
Like I said, to me, a feminist foreign policy cannot be devoid of your domestic policy. So if a feminist foreign policy cannot be devoid of your domestic policy, it's automatically indigenous. It has to build off your domestic policy. It can't, India's feminist foreign policy or Sri Lanka's or Bangladesh's or Nepal feminist one is going to be, cannot be built off the domestic policies of America or the Sweden. It has to be built on the basis of what we are standing on today. And therefore, you have to adopt it to your own context. which is why there's probably much more equity in the way where Asia is standing on many of the issues today, and the space for us to make this our own. You know, you can't have an inequitable system based on age, for example, and demand that your engagement in another country does not have that for you to engage with them. You can't. You know, you can't demand that we are going to be non-ageist in another country while we are going to be ageist in our own country. You know, so I think as long as you, or we are not, you can't demand that, okay, women, I will not give reproductive right or abortion rights to women in my country, but I'm going to go to other countries and ask them to promote that right. It's morally invalid, you know, and so it's not going to fly. And at the end of the day, also, I think a lot of it is also very driven by how we culturally define equity. And actually, I think in Asia, historically, there was more space for women to have played an equitable role in ancient and medieval time. And I'm talking Asia, I'm not talking India. You take Indonesia, you take Cambodia, you take Nepal, you take Bangladesh, you India, you take Sri Lanka. Role for women traditionally across, whether you look at mythology or you just even look at historical, was much more defined in the global south than it was in the global north, where they had to fight for everything, from starting from slavery to franchise right to voting to be in the temple to be in the church to da da da. So I just believe that we have abdicated the principles that were dear to us. Now is the time to re-own them and say we are going to build on it culturally and socially. Nothing in at least I can say that nothing in our culture tells us to be inequitable. We have just made it so, And feminism, well, look, the global south made feminism its own. People like Professor Patel, Professor Chinoy, they've been at the forefront of the feminist debate, and it's a very much a feminist lens with a very, very Asian contextual reality. It is not an amalgamation of, yes, the principles started, the discourse might have become there, but it was very well adapted to the context and culture we are in. Right from the 1995 Beijing movement, where this was the voice. 1995 was the voice for making feminism South driven. And we've done that over the years. So I think now the fear to say, oh, it's a Western concept, that's just a way of saying that you are not interested in really taking this forward.
Avoiding the issue.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much, ma'am. We really appreciated you taking out your time and talking to us. And I think adding to this discourse really what equity means, what equality means, and how that perspective applies to everything in our lives. Thank you so much. We hope to see you back at IMPRI soon. And with that, I would love to move on to our next session.
Thank you so much.
I'm honored to invite Dr. Shweta Singh, Associate Professor at South Asian University in New Delhi, for her speech on feminist foreign policy, ideology, semantics, and India. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, IMPRI. Thank you, Professor Patel. And it's so wonderful to see Professor Chinoy. And I know Dr. Gopinath is online. And it's just wonderful to be part of this session. And thank you, Asia Foundation, for actually facilitating this. I just wanted to share my screen. So I'll just take a minute. And is it visible? Because I can't make out from my end.
Yes, you can go full screen also. Shweta ji?
Yes. Is it visible now, the full screen?
Not fully. You can go to insert design, transition, animation, and then slideshow. Above वहीं पे. That banner is troubling you. Okay, you can come down where the zoom option is there. No, there is a present option. Yeah, just उसके बाद. No, more left. उसके
Is it
और
fine now?
no ma'am, just behind that there is a present button. Yeah, that one. Yeah, right.
Is it
Yes.
fine?
Yes, perfect. Please go
Okay.
ahead.
Excellent. So, I mean, it's so interesting that we've been talking about in the last 2 days on ideas of feminist foreign policy. And I was very intrigued when I was, invited to talk on ideology semantics in India. And I've been thinking about these ideas. And I thought, where should we begin our story? And for me, it's an act of storytelling when we are thinking about feminist foreign policy, especially trying to build and unravel what is India's stand on the idea of feminist foreign policy. And I thought, to start with three questions. And I think these are three kind of guiding questions, in terms of the way forward. The what of feminist foreign policy, the why of feminist foreign policy, and the how of feminist foreign policy. So I think, to my mind, all these three questions are important when we are thinking about what has been the trajectory of feminist foreign policy globally, and what is the idea of difference when we are thinking about India's stand on feminist foreign policy. So, if I just take a minute to talk about each of these questions and how we can actually dwell on it. So, when I'm thinking about this idea of the what of feminist foreign policy, I think it's very important to start thinking about the genealogy of feminist foreign policy. What has been the sites from which ideas on feminist foreign policy? What has been the location of feminist foreign policy? And I think the question of location of feminist foreign policy is extremely important to think about global hierarchies. It's also very important to think about politics of erasure. It's very important to think about epistemic violence, specifically in the sense in the context of global south. The why of feminist foreign policy, I think the most intriguing question to my mind is why is it and what are the kind of states that adopt feminist foreign policy? Moral states, ethical states. Why is this kind of labeling important? How is it that India would like to position itself when it starts to think about, when India is thinking about its question of state identity? And the how of feminist foreign policy. What are the contradictions? Nandita was talking about the contradictions in the context of external and internal. And I think that's where the question of the how of feminist foreign policy again becomes important. So when we start to think about India, I think there's a minute that we need to start to interrogate this question of why not feminist foreign policy and why gender sensitive foreign policy. And I think that's where I think, I want to draw your attention to is start to think about the politics of normative labeling. I think the politics of labeling is very important. Why is it that India would want to foreground this idea of gender sensitive foreign policy? A few months back, there's been this conversation that Minister Jaishankar is talking about locating a genealogy in the context of strategic thinking on foreign policy in India. And very interestingly, there have been gaps or there have been silences in the context of feminist thinking on foreign policy. And I think that's where, I think the entry point or the push for us is to start to locate this genealogy of a gender sensitive foreign policy in a context like India. And I think that's extremely important because I think there's this politics of this privileging of global north in the context of foreign policy, which is okay, but it's also important to look at this alternative genealogy. And why do I say that? Because I think it's important to look at the trajectories in the context of how have states evolved differently in the global north and in the global south. And I think that's where, for instance, the whole context of the identity of India, the post-colonial identity of India becomes important. How does this translate, for instance, in the context of cartographic anxieties? Sankaran Krishna often talks about cartographic anxieties, and I would say the cartographic anxieties also play a very important role when we are trying to think about both ideas of moral exceptionalism and strategic pragmatism in the context of foreign policy. And while we are thinking about this, what are the contradictions within India, both internally as well as externally? So just moving forward, in that context, if you're looking at the what of foreign policy, the feminist foreign policy, there's this very interesting debate in the context of, there's this debate in the context of universal and the particular. And I think that also defines some of the key questions that feminist movements in the global south have raised, And I would talk about those questions in the context of dialogue, dissidence, and difference. And I think these 3 Ds are very important when we are also thinking about the ideas of the 3 Rs: rights, resources, and representation. And if we look at the 3 Rs that actually, define the ideas of feminist foreign policy, located in the, in a very ethical, in a very, in the context of the politics of ethics that the framing brings in, I think it's important to start looking at how is it that rights are being defined? Where is the location in the context of the ideational elements of the rights, resources, representation that we are talking about? We all know Sweden has been the moral arbitrator in the context of the feminist foreign policy that we are talking about. But what is it, for instance, that India would like to learn or take away from ideas that Mexico has been propounding? So, I think in that context, I think we need to pay careful attention to the ideas of universalism without getting locked into an ethnocentric template on the ideas of feminist foreign policy. So I think this is something which needs to be walked through very carefully. It is here again, the second point that I'm going to say is that, while we are talking about the 3 Rs, the rights, resources, representation, in conjunction with the 3 Ds, which is dialogue, dissidence, and difference, I think it's also important to see that, that how does India look at itself? Would India want to just be a kind of take on the role of a norm taker, or would it also be a norm entrepreneur? So I think that's where we are also looking at this politics of labeling, gender sensitive versus feminist foreign policy that we are talking about. The other is, I think if you're thinking about the whole context of the genealogy of feminist foreign policy, and I do know that you've had conversations yesterday also, I think there is need to reinterrogate the idea of this genealogy. How and where do we trace the origins of ideas of feminist foreign policy? It's very interesting to see that, Sweden, which in many ways would say it was the first in the context of the adoption of the label of feminist foreign policy. But is that really so? Are we talking about feminist foreign policy the way the label has been carved out by Sweden? Or are there elements of feminist foreign policy, for instance, in many of the countries in the global south? I think one can go back into history to look at ideas and the intersections on that context. Sweden often talks about the whole context of state-led feminism, or the version of Swedish feminism. But where are we again locating those genealogies? And I think that becomes extremely important. I think what I would say is there is a need to trace the rich feminist genealogies of activism, of protest, and anti-colonial resistance in the global south. And how do they actually, constitute the ideational component of a gender-sensitive foreign policy? And I think that's where we would need to foreground the idea of difference that I was talking about. So while we are in dialogue with the ideas of feminist foreign policy, there is also the other D that we need to pay attention to, which is the idea of difference. And I think that also means, how do we think about the ideas of feminism itself? There is no singular approach when we are thinking about the ideas of feminist within feminist foreign policy. And I think that goes deeper. As a student of international politics, I often think about diplomatic histories. And I think it's very interesting to look at who writes diplomatic histories. Where do we locate these diplomatic histories? Are they actually, meta-narratives on diplomatic histories? Why is it that when we are thinking about the global south, we need to look at alternative sites of knowledge production? For instance, oral histories. How would we look at differing indigenous traditions on the ideas of these histories? And I think what is very interesting is also that this is very closely tied to the politics of epistemic marginalization and the complexity of knowledge production. I just wanted to bring this book to your attention. It's a very interesting book. It's Women, Diplomacy and International Politics since 1500, and it's been edited by Sluga and Carolyn James. Very interestingly, I think this has very interesting case studies, from the everyday lives of women, traces diplomatic history, but marginalizes voices from the global south. And it goes back to the same question: where are we locating feminist histories? Is there a need to deprovincialize Europe when we start to think about feminist histories? And I think the point that I'm trying to make is not to delegitimize the differing histories, but to pay attention to more the idea of plurality within histories. And I think that's extremely important when we start to establish this dialogue with ideas of feminist foreign policy. I think that's where the 3Ds become extremely important. And I keep going back to these 3Ds. So, for instance, if you're looking at the politics of labeling and the whole context of feminist foreign policy, I think I'm just talking about India here. We could be looking at an alternative feminist lineage in terms of strategic thinking in India. And it's very interesting. I mean, I work on the Therigatha, which is actually the collection of the first, 6th century BC collection of poems by the first Buddhist nuns. And I think the ideas of intersectionality that we talk about right now can actually be traced back to 6th century BC. The idea of multilateralism that we are talking about can actually be traced back to the 6th century text. The idea of, problematizing the idea of binaries can again be taken back to these texts. The idea is to actually widen your canvas in terms of the sites that we are thinking about. The other very fascinating, diplomatic practices that you can trace is, for instance, in the work of Jahanara Begum, the whole context of practice of persuasion as diplomatic strategy, or Ruqayya Sakhawat Begum's ideas on feminist utopia, Gargi and Yajnavalkya on the ideas of dialogue. So I think what is important is to give due recognition to alternative feminist lineage in strategic thinking. And I think that's where I would go back to my first point in terms of thinking about the idea of universal versus particular. And I think the thin line here is that the particular should not get locked in the context of ethnocentrism. In fact, it's very interesting, and I say this with a word of caution here, that many of the ideas that we are talking about in the context of post-colonial scholarship also tends to be usurped in times which are very populist radical right in its orientation. So it's a very thin line when we start to talk about this tracing of alternative genealogies located in specific sites. How do we actually traverse this thin line? And I think that's a big challenge in the context of both academic scholarship as well as practice, the appropriation of the language of this alternative genealogy. And I think that's something that we need to be mindful of. Now, in that context, I would say that in the context of India, I think there is a lot of strategic thinking in the context of this alternative feminist lineage that we're talking about. And I think India has been talking about its leadership in the context of not just as, in the context of norm-entrepreneur. And I think the language of gender-sensitive foreign policy is a space to build transnational solidarity across differing voices in the global south. And I mentioned Mexico, and I think that's where the synergy really comes in if we look at the framework of action that we've been talking about. Now, when and again, coming back to this whole question of politics of labeling, I think why is there a strategic hesitancy in the Indian foreign policy establishment to look at the idea of feminist foreign policy? I think there's a lot of push on ideas of feminist foreign policy without embracing the word feminist foreign policy. And I think what is being foregrounded is the ideas of gender-sensitive foreign policy. And I think the idea of gender-sensitive foreign policy speaks to the contextual realities. We are talking about, as I said, the politics of knowledge production and the contextual realities in the global south. But it's also important to think about the politics of labeling from what is usually an outward normative orientation. So for instance, even when we talk about WPS, Women, Peace and Security Agenda, it's very interesting to see how many countries were talking about WPS, and WPS is part of their foreign policy, and it's intricately connected to external funding. So for instance, Australia would talk about, paying attention to ideas of WPS, or Scandinavian countries would talk about WPS. But what is the focus area? It's Afghanistan, which becomes a laboratory to test ideas of WPS. What I'm trying to bring your attention to is the contradiction between the external and the internal. Sweden has been talking about feminist foreign policy, but Sweden, interestingly, also has been selling arms to countries which have been involved in deadly conflicts. There is also the politics in the context of what has been the internal orientation of Sweden vis-a-vis its own domestic constituencies. So has it been able to look at an intersectional lens when it's been talking about this whole idea of state feminism and feminist foreign policy? So I think the core point is pay attention to the politics of labeling and the outward normative orientation in any of the labels that we are talking about. And I think this is also very important to understand the strategic hesitancy that many global South actors would have towards adoption of the label feminist foreign policy. And why is it that there is the idea of gender sensitive foreign policy speaks to a context like India? And I think we need to have more conversations, more dialogue on just the politics of label. I think the whole context of, and there's a lot of interesting work, just to add to this, there's a lot of interesting work. For instance, Tony Hashrup talks about why is it that, we want to use the word gender sensitive foreign policy in the context of, for instance, Africa. What is the whole context? Again, going back to the same question, the ideational component that defines the roots of the feminist foreign policy. So I think that's something that we need to be closely thinking about. In terms of just the label that we've been talking about. I think in the context of India, if you're looking at a gender balanced foreign policy or the India way, there's been a lot of emphasis on protection, participation, prevention, and peace building. The idea is decentering the epistemic hegemony that we're talking about, paying attention to the colonial gaze, the politics of empire. But each of the three Ps, I would say one should look at with a pinch of salt. There's a bit of cynicism, for instance, in the idea of protection. Because when you're thinking about the idea of protection, I would say as well as participation, I would say you need to be paying attention to the structural inequalities in the context of the institutional system against which this is operating. So each of the three Ps that India has been talking about, protection, participation, prevention, the challenge is the translation of these three Ps in the context of both the internal and the external. So if you're looking at some of the key, key markers, the army has sent, for instance, the largest contingent of women peacekeepers for the UN. We know about this. There's also the whole context of G20, multilateralism and women's-led development. There's been a lot of emphasis in the context of, the whole context of India not being the norm recipient to norm entrepreneur. But having said that, and I'll come back to this point on normative implementation. Having said that, as I said, there is the challenge of normative translation. And when I say the challenge of normative translation, I want to actually, draw your attention to the kind of patriarchal entrenchments that we are talking about. The Global Gender Gap Report 2024 has just been released, and it's very interesting. And it's also very disheartening to see that India closed 64.1% of its gender gap in 2024. It ranks the third lowest in the region, only ahead of Maldives and Pakistan. So that's the kind of challenge that we're dealing with. So, we use the word gender sensitive foreign policy. We have our own challenges with the word feminist in the feminist foreign policy, but this is exactly the contradiction that we're talking about. Be it gender sensitive foreign policy or the feminist foreign policy that we are talking about, how do we actually translate that into a transformative agenda? For instance, in the context of the 3 Rs that we are talking about. Only 18% representation, for instance, in the context of the foreign service officers that we are talking about. If you're talking about representation, if you're looking at the labor participation rate in India, it's much lower than the global average. If you're looking at the whole context of protection, again, how is it also tied to the whole context of institutional governance mechanisms that we are talking about, women, peace and security, and I know Professor Chinoy would be talking about and the whole ideas on women, peace and security. But if you look at the discourse in India in the context of women, peace and security, India is not a signatory and has not adopted the National Action Plan. It would not talk about conflicts in the context of the definitional aspects of conflict that we would talk about. So I think what we are really, the challenge for us is normative translations. And I think the normative translations, if you're looking at this idea of normative translations, we need to pay close attention to internal contradictions. And I think so, I mean, where are we in terms of this conversation, and how is it that we go back to some of the key ideas that we are talking about? I think what we are looking at, as I said right at the beginning, we need to be attentive to the politics, A, of the labels that we are using, feminist foreign policy or gender sensitive foreign policy. B, we need to be looking at the contradictions which are inherent, irrespective of the labels that we are talking about. And I think that's where you also need to be very attentive to how do you actually strike a, this transnational solidarity, or how do you actually expand this canvas in terms of the conversations on the ideas of feminist foreign policy itself. And I think that's extremely important if we are looking at how do we actually push the agenda forward, rather than simply translate this or adopt this from the ways that it has been articulated in the global north. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was such a critical perspective on knowledge and information. And again, before I open the floor for questions, I would like to invite Professor Vibhuti Patel for her comments.
Thank you, Dr. Sweta Singh, for providing a matrix and the theoretical framework for questioning the agenda of the North. Now, even after accepting your 3Ds, okay, what should be the thumb rule for any foreign policy, whether it is gender sensitive or feminist, number one. Number two, in your framework of analysis, where do you locate neoliberal economic policies pursued by world capitalism?
Professor Patel, I've lost your voice.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I said, where do you locate in your framework of analysis, where do you locate neoliberal economic policies pursued by world capitalism and the kind of its fallout for the population in South and the neo-colonial nation states? And second one is that even after accepting your 3Ds, do we have any universal thumb rule for the foreign policy, whether you call it feminist foreign policy or gender equal foreign policy?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Patel. I think very interesting questions. I think the idea of 3Ds is, and I think this is also a contention when we start to think about, for instance, feminist IR in South Asia, we've always pushed for, that there is no one singular approach to thinking about feminist IR. And I think, Professor Kumari Jayawardene, who was writing in the late 1980s, was really talking about the idea of differing voices. And I think so when we're thinking about feminist foreign policy, to my mind, it's extremely important to recognize the idea of plurality. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be foregrounded. And I think that's something that Nandita was also talking about, that, how do you actually bring together differing voices? So if you're talking about, the sites of feminist foreign policy, I think you need to, again, widen your campus. Widen your canvas. Start to think about, and that's why I think I started off with this whole idea of tracing an alternative genealogy of feminist histories itself. So, for instance, there's such rich, feminist historical traditions in South Asia, in India. I think that's something where you need to draw your attention to. And I think that is a push that, to my mind, becomes very important when we start to think about foreign policy, or when we start to think about feminist foreign policy, irrespective of the labels that we start to adopt. And I think in that context, and I think that again links back to your first question in the context of the neoliberal agenda or the neoliberal policies that you were talking about. Again, the idea of difference is the key here. And I think the politics of a neoliberal agenda also needs to be paid attention to. So, for instance, and I think that's the that's the point that I was trying to make. The whole politics of outward orientation of either a feminist foreign policy or the WPS agenda. We need to be looking at what kind of states are talking about this. Where is it that the why of it needs to be interrogated more critically?
Thank you, ma'am. Again, I'm going to sort of consolidate some of the themes I'm seeing. A common question is, what is the link between marginalized communities or marginalized women inside of a country with the country's foreign policy and national interest?
Okay. So one of the things, Varishka, I think, and that's where we've been talking about, we need to pay attention to how do we foreground the lens of intersectionality when we start to think about feminist foreign policy. So for instance, you cannot be talking about rights, resources, and representation. And I'm giving you the example of Sweden here. You can't be talking about rights, representation, and resources. And at the same time, you talk about migrant Black woman or a migrant brown woman, a migrant brown Muslim woman, and there is a contradiction that comes in there. So I think that is the kind of perspective that I'm drawing your attention to, that you also need to be looking at the idea of difference, connected, very closely connected to the idea of marginalization. And that's where I think it becomes important to foreground intersectionality when you start to think about ideas of feminism itself. And I think that's extremely important.
Thank you so much. Another more theoretical question was, when you sort of talk about universalism and particularism, um, does universalism get equated with ethnocentrism? And what sort of universal values can be promoted in cultures that are inherently diverse, like in India?
I think the challenge, Varushka, is that this is an ongoing debate. I don't think one can really answer in the context of a yes or a no, because there's this whole context of transnational feminist movements, transnational solidarities, global sisterhood that we're talking about. But at the same time, we're also talking about the idea of difference within the context of feminist movements. And I'm just going to draw your attention and think about the differing trajectories of feminist movements itself. And I think that's something that I really said, in between, that while we are talking about this idea of labels, I think what we need to be very attentive to in times of populist radical right is how a post-colonial lens also tends to be appropriated by the populist radical right. That's a big challenge. So a lot of this conversation in terms of going back to particularities, going back to alternative sites, can also be appropriated. So that's a big challenge. That's really a big challenge in these times. This is this is the tight walk in terms of the universal framings that we are talking about, which is extremely important, which we've all fought for in the context of activism and practice that we're talking about. But at the same time, paying attention to contextual realities. And I said, Varushka, honestly, I wouldn't have a yes or no answer, because this is difficult. There are many gray zones that we need to pay attention to.
Yes, thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for providing such an academic and critical perspective on what feminism means, where that knowledge comes from, and how we can use it. We at IMPRI loved having you here and loved and appreciated that you took your time to talk to us, and we hope we continue to talk to you in the future. And with that, I would like to move on to our final session for the day. I'm honored to invite Professor Anuradha M. Chinoy, Adjunct Professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs, Jindal Global University, the former Dean at School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, for her speech on women, peace, and security. We welcome you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, friends at IMPRI, Professor Vibhuti Patel, Nandita Barua, and my co-panelists, and all those who are attending. I'm indeed very honored to be here and delighted to be able to speak on this. Now, while the broad theme today is on feminist foreign policy, and I'm going to touch on it briefly, but I've specifically been asked to speak on women, peace, and security. And I'm glad that you have chosen this topic, because women, peace, and security actually goes beyond a feminist foreign policy, precisely because of the point raised by Nandita, if I may call you by your first name, in the very beginning, that what links the external to the domestic. And women, peace, and security, because insecurity and peace is not only interstate at the macro level, but within states, And there are more conflicts within states. 90% or right, 85% of conflicts are within states. Identity conflicts, religious conflicts, conflict over water, over land, and these conflicts are all gendered. So women's security and peace is really, it cuts across foreign policy, international relations, international politics, and the domestic. So I think my second point is that the whole arguments and discussion and research on women, peace, and security have also come a long way. And yet many questions remain, and it's an open research question. And in this context of women, peace, and security, the international feminist movement, the local feminist movements, and local women, grassroots women, have been engaged and are a very important resource, even though this resource and their work has not been recognized. And it is time to really not just acknowledge it, but write their histories. And again, I was very glad that I think Nandita in the beginning, and Patel actually, raised the issue of the role of people like Nirmala Deshpande and Asma, both of whom, with whom I was fairly deeply engaged with. So I want to thank you really for bringing them up. So now in today's context, women, peace and security and feminist, foreign policy is especially critical. Because just look at what Shweta raised on the question of what the North is doing. The major war, the major militarization, the major drive for hegemony is coming from the northern states. And so I would argue right at the beginning, in a controversial thing, that actually countries of the global south, just like women, have never been hegemonic. And therefore, they are more feminist in their foreign policy without saying it, at least theoretically, because I'm arguing that neutrality today, that non-alignment, is what spontaneously would have been a feminist foreign policy. Not aligning with militarist blocs, saying no to NATO, asking for negotiation, multilateralism, international law, etc. But I'll go back into this. So I think now just to get into the crux of my argument, what is it? How do we understand women, peace, and security? And we understand them. We have been understanding them, and our fight to have women in peace and in security is to challenge the fact that these were all gendered concepts. So how do we, and also we need to know, and I think I'll do a very quick building block as to what is gender, women, feminism in one line. And of course, so we understand gender as, sex as biology and gender as sociology. And in this, even security has a gender aspect, the dominant discourses have a gender aspect. So we have to see the relationship between gender and peace and security, which is not static in its conceptualization, framing, or practice, and moves with time. So, of course, there is the ideological, the material, and sociological aspects of gender, which have been part of culture, socialization, our own self-description, our image and experiences of our bodies, the bodies of others, our gaze of how we look at our own bodies and the bodies of others, our responsibilities, and their institutionalization in states and structures, which we've been talking about, and the national, domestic, and in the international. So all this has been gendered. So obviously, security and even peace is gendered, even if women have been signifiers of peace, even if it has been said that women may be essentially peaceful. But the debates in the international movement now have challenged these, but yet there are a lot of basic issues which remain, and that is because of this ideology of patriarchy and masculinity within states, within political parties, which comes into the social structure repeatedly, and especially into the security sector. Despite the women's movement asking for security sector reforms, asking that women be part of peace and security, there are still major issues which I am going to speak about. Now, so how are wars and conflicts so gendered? That is, if seen for, the history of humankind, the history of mankind, as they call it, has been dominated. The history of states has been dominated by, power. When power itself is gendered, power is relational. In this relationship of power of, one, it's always the domination of one gender over the other, that is a masculine gender over women. So women have been traditionally left out of power relations, whether it's in the home, it's in the society, it's in the community, in the state, or in the international. And therefore, and the fact that they uphold honor of the community, and I'm not going to go into those debates. Those are, very well documented debates of how rape and sexual violence has been used to humiliate women and the community and exclude them from peace and decision making. And this has been challenged, but it still remains. And that is why we still are asking for a feminist foreign policy. We're still asking for women be included into security, because even though at some level these have been shown up and challenged, it still remains. And women still dominantly, their value remains in the caring activity, in the terms of chastity, honor, etc. And as Shweta said, who wrote these manuscripts on victories, on wars, and where were the women in this peace and politics? Of course, now, recently, especially since the 1979 CEDAW Convention and the Beijing Convention on Women, the international women's movement, and here, I think Shweta brought up this debate on whether feminism is all about North giving ideas to the South. There is a universality also in this. The fact that it was brought up recently that women need to be in these 3 Ps, which came up in Security Council Resolution 1325 of prevention, participation, and protection, that they need to be there, because otherwise there is no way that we are moving forward in engaging women or getting women into the conversation, or actually into the policies and practice of peacekeeping and preventing wars and protecting them. Security and peace will continue to be gendered, because even though, and the idea that women will continue being victims in wars, and they have to be protected, and to protect, for seeking protection, then they have to give up their rights. So all these ideas have been challenged, but nonetheless, even now, 70% of refugees continue to be women. And you've seen what's have been happening in Palestine, for example, where a very masculinist state and ideology has been killing women and children. So again, even though they might have had agency, they've again become refugees. They're again victims. And the global North has many of the states which are talking about a feminist foreign policy has been complicit in this genocide. So we are almost in practice back to square one. And this brings us to this debate of feminism. So again, I agree with what Nandita said, that feminism really is, of course, it is that liberal feminism about that women should be equal. But it is also, I think, that feminism means that it's a theory which not just asks for equality of women, but it also asks for tolerance, for recognizing the other, for debate, for negotiation, and it abhors war. And that is where a very steep difference has now arisen in the feminist movement. because they are the liberal feminists who've had this individual empowerment because the state has given them the right. They have given them the right to combat. They have given them the right to join militaries, to fly planes, all very good. And so they feel that, that they have achieved women's equality and feminism, whereas other women who are still veiled or still don't have rights, do not, are outside this debate. But the issue really is, what is feminism's relationship to peace and security, as opposed to women's relationship to peace and security? So the liberal feminists are arguing now that they should become, part of militaries, and it's their right of choice and agency. Whereas other feminists are arguing that with that kind of liberal feminism, the kind of liberal feminism espoused by, let's say, Hillary Clinton or Madeleine Albright, who said if 1 million Iraqi children were killed because of sanctions, it was frankly worth it, because the state and their feminism of being in the state and being equal and being able to say that and being co-opted into the military apparatuses and security apparatuses was enough. Is that the real feminism, or is the other feminism, the pacifist feminism, which says, yes, feminism is still linked to peace. The core of it should be not to be co-opted into militarism and that kind of state masculinity, but to be tolerant of others, to understand the different cultures, the specificities, that not all women can be on the same level of in getting individual equality in all societies. And that doesn't mean that, you oppose intervention, etc. Of course, all these feminisms could be legitimate. I'm not saying that the liberal feminism is illegitimate and this is the only feminism. Feminism, by its very definition, is plurality, is pluralism, is diversity, and it's acceptance. So what I'm saying is that liberal feminists should also engage with the pacifist feminisms, which they have not done. They assert, those in the state especially, those in civil society still do. So one set of feminism has got engulfed in militarism, which is the core of hegemony and patriarchy. And they really want the presence of women and their choice. So I'm not, again, saying that this is completely wrong. Women must have agency. But the other side, which is also arguing that the true form of feminism opposes masculine, opposes a machinery of war and the institutions that enable it. So ultimately, the question will rest with us. Which is the feminism we want? Because a mass of women are not part of this elite women's feminism, and they will not be part of foreign policy apparatuses defending their states. They will be negotiating their peace and security on the ground, vis-a-vis another community, vis-a-vis another neighborhood, where insecurity is happening at a greater level. And at the other hand, there would be women who are totally within these militarist discourse. And you can see it, for example, in our own country, in Manipur. We kind of privileged the IMAs and the women's movement, but there were a lot of articles I read where they actually, when it came to the community, they did not support the cause of negotiation and peace, but they supported the cause of their community vis-a-vis another community, which they felt was overtaking their identity. And you can see that in inter-identity conflicts in India, in South Asia, etc. So therefore, what I'm arguing is that women, peace and security means one thing at the state level, at the international level, and another at the grassroots level altogether. And I think we need to study both these different levels when we talk about women, peace, and security, and about how foreign policy impacts them. So one form of feminism and women, peace, and security, where women have now been included into foreign services, into which is all great, into armies, which is wonderful. So they have won a personal battle, but they have lost the social war. Because when you have these terrible wars and threats of nuclear, I think it should be women and the women's movement who should take it up and say no to both sides and argue for peace. But if you're arguing on behalf only of aggression and your right to hegemony, you need to understand why countries of the global south have opted out of these debates. They're not saying we have a feminist foreign policy, but I would say today that I would question some aspects of Sweden's feminist foreign policy, whereas I would endorse the feminist foreign policy of states which have never talked about it in the global south, who are saying, for example, Vietnam, which is saying 4 no's: no to military alliance, no to military blocs, no to siding with any group which is taking up arms, and no to nukes. So I think those are the core of a feminist foreign policy, without having to, put it on your badge that this is a feminist foreign policy. And I think if Sweden and Norway, etc., did that, maybe you would have more peace. At least that is a particular position. So I think feminism also means looking for a just system. A system of intersectionality means that a peace which has social justice. It is peace with the eco-feminists who believe in ecology, which questions neoliberal policies, which are moving towards destroying our forests and our ecologies, and not moving towards climate change. And these are hard foreign policy issues. And I believe that what they call soft foreign policy is actually the hard foreign policy, because those are the existential threats. Those are the threats to our survival. The threat to our survival, of course, sovereignty is important, is not as important. And in these wars, there are no victors. Victory is illusionary. And whatever war does, peace does better. So I argue for more women in security, in peace, and for tens of thousands of women who are losing their children today. The war, whichever side they're on, has already been lost. So thank you very much. I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Mom. That was a very engaging conversation, and there was a good sort of elaboration of what we've been speaking about today. Once again, I would like to invite our chair for her remarks.
So, Professor Anuradha Chinoy, you brought in such a disturbing reality of jingoism, militarization, millions of masses from global south rendered homeless, the heartless migration policy, mass killing. But when it comes to elite feminists, they use the same terminologies as we do. They also talk of intersectionality. But when it comes to praxis, you see they are completely at a different this thing. They are taking all the advantages of white patriarchy. I think that's what our sister from African National Congress was saying. That they talk of feminism and sisterhood is powerful, but they are part of the white patriarchy in the world. Now, in this disturbing and I won't say hopeless, but very bleak situation, what do you see as a ray of hope? Are we in a situation where there is a one step forward, the kind of position which South Africa took by approaching International Criminal Court, but we are also at the same time going 2 steps backward, as Comrade Lenin would say? What is your analysis of the global geopolitics?
Look, I think Professor Patel, you raised a very pertinent issue, because this is the same dichotomy that the human rights movement is facing. because the West does talk rightly about human rights. We all want human rights and democracy. But when they have Operation Desert Freedom and they want to impose democracy and human rights with bombs and NATO planes into Iraq and regime change in Syria, or removing who they call is a dictator in Libya, then, the whole argument of human rights gets challenged. But that doesn't mean that human rights is wrong. Just like liberal feminists or the Western feminists today, they talk about sisterhood, but then they would support more bombs for, for nuking the Palestinians on the ground. That doesn't mean feminism is wrong. It's up to us then to question their approach and to say feminism overall and rights of women and equality is right, but we have to implement, but this hypocrisy is also wrong. We don't throw out the theory and the idea like the baby with the bathwater, but we try to hold on and sieve out what is right in human rights, and what is wrong in the way it's being implemented hypocritically, that it must come from the grassroots. And that is what also intersectionality should mean. The link of the elite with the grassroots. The link with that a theory can also come from below. Our appeal, for example, you raise the issue of the cups, that maybe there should be women-led cups, that there should not be, okay, we had 1/3 reservation of women in panchayats, but these informal structures, these should also be penetrated. And let's hear the women, what they have to say about this. So democratize, so we're not going to go against democracy just because some elected Democrat is actually an elected autocrat. But democracy is still valuable. So feminism and human rights are still valuable, even though there are levels of hypocrisy and diversions within them.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The first question I want to raise is there's a couple of questions about how feminist foreign policy can address the challenges faced by women in conflict zones, and a common example being raised is of Kashmir in India. Yeah.
Well, look, women in foreign policy means that you have a state's position. So there is just about that much that you can do. You can do a little bit of maneuver, and if you don't, then you're put into what is called, the soft power. Okay, you attend to the migrant women, and you do humanitarian assistance, you do development assistance, and you look at and we need to have, but we fulfilled our quota, and we have 30% in our foreign policy. So maybe our gender gap will now not be 33%, but 64%. So congratulations all. But it's women outside that who do people-to-people conversations, if they can. And now, even if states prohibit, you can use what you're using today. This form of communication, did you ever think earlier that we could be doing a webinar where you might have 20% women from Pakistan and 30% people from India and 10% from other countries of the South all attending, because you have this methodology of communication. So it's a breakthrough and an opportunity to do a kind of a people-to-people foreign policy, to understand, to build relationships, and to challenge mainstream discourses. And that is how the cracks start whitening, and you can influence official foreign policy. So there's foreign policy at the state-to-state level, there's multilateralism, there is the academic discussion on it, And there are your own, the people's, like People's SARC, and in some places they are very effective, like the World Social Forums, etc. I know that's not part of state, but they impact policy ultimately, especially in the more democratic, but even in non-democratic systems. These ideas tend to trickle down, and they trickle down faster with our new modes of communication. Even though they may not be dominant, you never know when the crack comes and they become, and you can see that in things like elections, and how what seems like, a very hard system, people can still overthrow it. You can see how, as far as Kashmir is concerned, similarly, people have worked on it. I think I've seen both sides of the Kashmir border, the Pak occupied Kashmir. I've been there also, and there also people have been equally, they've been wanting to engage and change the system. It's not easy, it takes time, history is hard, but ultimately the oppressed do, if they resist, they do make their point in history, and you can refer to it in so many ways.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question being raised is, now that we've reached a point in the discourse of feminism in general and feminist foreign policy where we're questioning where certain ideology comes from, what the implementations are governments being able to change their approaches to feminist foreign policy to be more diverse, to be more inclusive? What is the path ahead in terms of that?
Yeah, I think this has been discussed in the course of this panel earlier in terms of the formal structures opening up because of international pressure, because they're signatories to treaties, they're signatories to Security Council resolutions like 1325, 1820, and many others, which say that women must be part of policy making, they must be represented in politics, they must be there in prevention. So and of course, just the formal is not enough. I think, as again, Professor Patel said, because it doesn't always smoothly and very easily go into the informal and into implementation. But nonetheless, even that opens up spaces, I believe. Because when you see, let's say, a woman foreign secretary, like how India's had, or women ambassadors, or women representing India at the UN, then other younger women say, okay, maybe I have a chance. Maybe I can do something, and I don't have to get married at 16 or seek permission at 18. If they've done it, so can I. So the process is slow, but I think it's not sometimes not fast enough, and it just remains at formal structures. Because you can see that, for example, with what happened with the introduction in 1977 of the Panchayat Act, where women were said, now the panchayats will have 30%, 33% representation of women. For a long time, you had men coming and saying that they were panchayat patis. I myself attended seminars, in Constitutional Cup, where the women, they still had their ghungat, and the men spoke, and we said, why are you speaking? Because we are panchayat patis. So, but this has changed now. The women are saying, forget it. We are going to say it ourselves. So it takes time. So the formal, and here again, I always believe the role of civil society and academia, engaged academics, is very important, where you can widen these and relate, join the dots. Because there's so much information also that people are not unable very often to join the dots and say, no, you're also capable of doing this. And I think that is what is important about today's this meeting and this discussion. And I'm really grateful to IMRI and Isha Foundation for having done this, really.
Thank you so much, Professor Chinoy. We really appreciate you taking out the time to talk to us, and we hope we continue to talk to you. And thank you for sort of giving us a concluding speech and summing up everything that we've spoken about. And with that, I would like to call on our chair once again for her closing remarks for the day.
Thank you, Varushka. We had a very, very interesting discussion, and I think good. Nandita ji is also here. Would you also like to say, or should I make my concluding remarks? I think we had a very enriching conversations, and which created a new lens of looking at feminist foreign policy. And so mine is on. Yeah, fine. So, like feminist foreign policy will give a major boost to countries' international relations when it is committed to women's empowerment at grassroots levels and extensively build a stronger partnership with the countries that have adopted feminist foreign policy with commitments to make transformative change in favor of vulnerable masses facing multiple marginalities. I think all three speakers, they drove this point, and this is a major learning of today's discussions. Another important note that we can make is that India dropped to 129th place in World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index 2024, which was released day before yesterday, and it is being talked very seriously among the women's movement and the think tanks, and the media is also deliberating upon this issue, that when Ireland retains its top position, India ranks fifth in the South Asia. That means we are behind Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Pakistan is just behind us. So despite progress in economic participation and educational enrollment, India's political empowerment and representation of women have remained low. And globally, the gender gap will take 134 years to close the current rate, according to the World Economic Forum. That can happen only when we don't do anything. But I think that's not the spirit in which we are discussing this issue. And increasing political representation, voice, also technical know-how, leadership, capacity building for leadership among women, dealing with the issue of economic inequality and putting in place macroeconomic policy in favor of transformative change for gender equality, I think is very important. At the same time, enhancing work participation of women is very important. I think most of the South Asian countries have this characteristics. India has one of the lowest. Behind us is only Pakistan. So the major boost that we can have for the better performance in global gender gap also depends on the kind of collaborations we have, and we also have so many countries with best practices. I think the post-colonial countries, whether they are in Latin America or Asia, I think we can learn a lot from each other, and we need to continue such consultations and dialogues. That's the only solution. And I think the scenario at one level looks very overwhelming with the war and militarization and migrant crisis and the post-pandemic economic downturn. But at the same time, efforts at the grassroots levels, which are happening all over, they provide ray of hope, and I'm an eternal optimist. I think we collectively we can solve this crisis, and we can meet the challenges of world on this planet. Especially Nandita ji also highlighted the question of climate resilience that we need to develop, and I think that for that also all of us have to work together. So I think solidarity, transnational solidarity, and action at a grassroots level, these are the two important learnings of today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Patel. And with that, we come to the end of day 2 of Feminist Foreign Policy, Past, Present, and Future, a 3-day immersive online certificate training symposium. And I, Varushka Bhushan, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to propose the formal vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI and the Asia Foundation. We are grateful to our experts for the day 2 session, Ms. Nandita Barua, Dr. Shweta Singh, and Professor Anuradha Chinoy, for taking out their valuable time and allowing us to learn from this program. We thank our chair for convening on all the sessions, and we thank our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We look forward to welcoming you tomorrow on June 26th for day 3 of our course. And we are grateful if you're watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in to IMPRI Web Policy Talks and Web Policy Learnings. We wish you a wonderful day. Thank you again for joining us and spending time with us today.